I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's the plain truth of it. My name's Wade Fisher, and I'd spent most of my adult life fixing sawmill equipment. The kind of work where, if a belt snaps or a bearing seizes you, solve that one problem and move on to the next. Grief didn't work like that. After my wife, Mara, died, the house we'd rented in town turned into a room-by-room reminder that I had failed at the one repair job that mattered. My son, Eli, and I stayed 6 months longer than we should have, moving around each other like guests until one morning he stood in the kitchen with his backpack on and asked if we could go where Grandpa's pear tree was. He was 11, all elbows and quiet eyes, and I said yes before I had time to think. My dad's old homestead sat on a ridge where the orchard sloped into mixed timber, apple and pear trees giving way to alder, fir, and cedar that held mist long after sunrise. The place was tired. Fences sagged. The pump house leaned. One corner of the barn roof had a curl in it like a lifted shingle fingernail. But it was ours, and it gave a man enough to do that he could pretend he was coping. I became practical to a fault. Feed bins, fence wire, stove ash, lunch money in Eli's pocket. Permission slip signed. Then work 2 days a week at the orchard down County Road, pruning and hauling bins for cash, plus whatever repairs folks needed on chainsaws and splitters. I told myself that steady hands and a full checklist were the same thing as healing. They weren't, but a list never argued with me. The harder truth was what happened to my voice. I answered my boy in half sentences because full ones felt dangerous. How was school? Fine. You finish your math? Mostly. Need help? Nope. He learned to accept the chopped-up version of me, and that sat heavy in my chest at night when the wood stove ticked and settled. I'd hear him in his room, turning pages, and think, say something real. Ask what he misses. Tell him what you miss. Then my throat would lock like a rusted hinge, and I'd settle for lights out in 10. The shame of that was quieter than grief, but it stayed longer. Mornings had their own rhythm, and we kept it, because routine is a kind of raft. I got up at 5:30, split kindling by the back step, packed Eli's lunch, and burned one piece of toast out of habit because I was always trying to do 3 things at once. The one bright spot was Brisket, our old hound, who supervised every task as if he drew a salary. He had a grey muzzle, one droopy ear, and the confidence of a mare. I'd be wrestling a jammed thermos lid, and he'd sit there with his chest out like he'd personally arranged sunrise. I once caught myself saying, "Can't do this without you, Foreman." And he sneezed directly on my boot, which felt about right for management style on this property. Eli was careful in the way some kids get after loss, as if loudness might break something else. He still laughed, but he checked my face first. One Tuesday, while I was scraping frost off the truck windshield, he asked if we had to keep Mara's blue mug in the cabinet if nobody used it. The question was small, but I felt it in my ribs. I took too long to answer, and he watched me like he was grading an exam. "We can keep it," I said, "or box it either way." He nodded, then shrugged like it didn't matter. It mattered to both of us. I wanted to say her name right there. I wanted to tell him I heard her humming every time I reached for coffee. Instead, I told him to grab his gloves. Neighbours were kind in that country way where they offered help without crowding you. Mrs. Klein from 2 parcels over dropped off canned peaches and acted like she had made too many. Roy Atkin, who ran the feed store, knocked $10 off my invoice and blamed the register. Nobody asked direct questions unless I opened the door first, which I usually didn't. One afternoon, Roy leaned on the counter while I paid for mineral block and dog feed and said, "You and that boy settling in?" I said, "Getting there." He studied me for a beat and replied, "Getting there counts." That was all. It was exactly enough, and also, somehow, too much. Evenings were the hardest. After homework and dishes and laying out school clothes, Eli disappeared into his room with a library book, and I'd drift out to the back pasture where the orchard ended. The boundary wasn't marked by fence so much as mood. In the orchard, rows and pruning cuts and known work. In the timber, layered shadows and old windfall and things living on their own terms. I'd stand with my hands in my coat pockets and listen to crows settle, to distant creek noise, to the soft clink of the gate chain when the breeze shifted. If you've lived rural, you know the paradox. There are chores everywhere, engines to tune, troughs to scrub, wood to stack, and still loneliness can sit down right beside you like it paid taxes. I had never been a believer in anything you couldn't put a wrench on. Folks around here told stories when weather pinned them indoors, and I was always the one saying there's a reason for everything. Most of them boring. Coyotes are just coyotes. Sounds in the trees are branches and squirrels and wind doing what wind does. I held that line because it kept the world stable. There are enough non-trivial trade-offs in keeping a place running with one paycheck and one growing kid. You don't need mystery on top of that. So when Eli started carrying bruised apples from the sorting crate to the edge of the timber, I assumed it was one more child ritual in a year full of them. The first time I noticed, he crouched by the big flat stone near the old stump and set down 2 soft apples with both hands like he was placing eggs. Brisket sat beside him and watched with solemn interest. "What's that for?" I asked. Eli didn't look embarrassed, which told me he had already made peace with my opinion. "For something hungry," he said. "Deer don't come this close at dusk," I replied. He shrugged. "Then maybe not deer." I should have pushed for a practical answer, but the look on his face stopped me. It wasn't fantasy. It was generosity, or maybe bargaining with a world that had taken too much. I said, "All right, just don't leave the good ones. Bruised fruit only." He gave me a quick nod like we'd signed a treaty. We built a strange little routine around it without discussing it much. After supper, he'd check the coal bin, pick 2 or 3 apples, and walk them to the tree line while I latched the chicken run and checked the goat pen. Some nights he asked Brisket to come along, and that old dog would trot at his heel, pausing to sniff the grass and glance back at me as if to ask whether this counted as official duty. I told myself it was harmless, maybe even healthy. Kids need ways to offer care when they can't fix what hurts. Truthfully, I needed that too, but I wasn't ready to name it. By the 3rd morning, the apples were gone. Cleanly gone, not ragged peels or chunks scattered through leaves. I walked out before daylight with coffee in a travel mug and found only stems laid side by side on the same flat stone. No bite marks on the skin, no torn pieces, no sign of raccoon paws in the mud. I stood there longer than made sense, mug cooling in my hand. My first decomposition of the problem was simple enough. Eli had cleared them away himself, maybe because he felt silly. But he was still asleep when I came in, one sock half off his foot, dead to the world. Then I considered deer and raccoons, then a fox, then one of the Atkins boys playing around. Every explanation worked, until it didn't. That night, I watched from the porch while Eli made his little offering. The moon was a thin white edge, and the pines held that early autumn resin smell that always reminded me of sawdust and cold steel. Brisket went with him, sat while Eli placed the apples, then returned with him at a calm pace. No hackles up, no backward glances. "Do you think it likes red ones better?" Eli asked as we climbed the steps. "What likes red ones?" I said, buying time. "Whatever's out there." He said it plain, no drama. I answered, "I think anything with taste buds likes red ones better." And he smiled for a second before it faded. At the sink, rinsing dishes, I heard myself about to say, "Your mum liked the tart green kind." The words reached my teeth and stopped there. I slept lightly and woke before dawn, to the house making its winter noises. Pipes ticking, boards settling, Brisket's nails scratching once on the hallway floor. I lay there and stared at the ceiling, thinking in the kind of blunt tally I always did when I was scared of my own mind. I was 38 and tired all the way through. I was raising a good boy with a half-full heart and pretending he couldn't tell. I was standing in old rooms trying to be my father and my wife and myself, and I was not enough of any of those men. Then I rolled out of bed, pulled on boots, and went outside because chores don't pause for private reckonings. At the tree line, the apples were gone again. 3 stems this time, set in a neat little fan on the stone. No tracks I could trust in the matted grass, just a flattened patch where dew had dried unevenly. I heard Eli's window slide up behind me and his sleepy voice call, "Dad, they take 'em." I looked back and saw him framed in that old sash window, hair sticking up, cheeks red from sleep. For a moment I nearly said something whole, something like, "I don't know what this is, but I'm glad you kept leaving kindness out here." Instead, I lifted the stems so he could see and said, "Looks that way." He grinned and disappeared from the window to get dressed for school. I stood at the edge of orchard and timber, while morning light moved through the firs in narrow bars, feeling vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with weather. And for the first time since we came back, I stayed there long enough to admit I did not understand what waited in those trees. And I was tired of pretending understanding was the only kind of safety. Brisket came up beside me and leaned his shoulder into my knee, like he was checking whether I'd tipped over inside my own head. I scratched behind his ear and looked back toward the stone, then out into the trees, then back again. Because that was the kind of morning where your mind kept trying to put things in the right box, and none of the labels fit. The ridge usually woke in layers. First jays, loud and rude, then smaller birds stitching quick sounds through the brush, then squirrel chatter, then the little wind noises in dry grass. That morning held none of it. Not silence exactly, but a held breath. Fir needles barely moved, no crows crossing. Even Brisket's tags sounded too sharp when he shifted and sat down. He didn't sit facing me. He sat facing one narrow gap between 2 old firs, where the ground dipped before rising again. His tail gave one slow thump against the grass, then stilled. No growl, no warning rumble, no stiff neck, just a tension, calm as a man waiting for a late bus. I told myself there was a plain reason for that. Dogs keyed on smells, on movement we missed, on routines they knew better than we did. Maybe a deer had crossed there every morning at dawn. Maybe he heard the Klein tractor from farther down the valley and pointed himself toward it. Maybe I was standing in cool air with too little sleep and too many thoughts, turning ordinary things into puzzles, because puzzles were easier than grief. I crouched by the flat stone to prove to myself I was still a reasonable man. That was when I saw the twigs. 2 short cedar twigs lay crossed over each other, centered where the stems had been, deliberate enough that no boot scuff or falling branch could explain it. Tucked beside them sat a pale, river-smooth piece of quartz, oval and clean, no dirt on it, as if it had been rinsed. There was no stream on our ridge that could have worn it like that. You got rock up here, yes, but rough, fractured, full of edge. This looked carried. I picked it up and turned it in my hand, cold, heavier than it looked. One side milky white and the other clear enough to catch early light. A little shiver worked up my arm, not fear, just recognition that I had stepped outside my usual framework and didn't know where to plant my feet. I checked the grass around the stone. No obvious tracks. Dew broken in an arc where something had passed, but the pattern was too faint to trust. I set the crossed twigs back exactly as I'd found them and stood up slowly, like the trees might bolt if I moved too quick. "Dad?" Eli's voice came from behind me, closer than before. He'd made it down the back steps in sock feet and a hoodie too thin for the morning chill. Brisket turned his head toward him, then back toward the same gap in the trees. "You're going to freeze your toes off," I said. Eli came to my side and saw the little arrangement. His face didn't open into surprise the way I expected. It went soft and serious, like he'd just been answered in a language he already believed existed. "That wasn't there yesterday," he said. "No," I said. "It wasn't." He looked out at the fur gap, same as the dog. "Do you think it's saying thanks?" The practical answer was sitting right there, ready to be used. Kids imagine. Wind moves things. People get strange ideas when they're tired. I had all those lines memorized. I could have delivered them clean. Instead, I rolled the quartz in my palm and said, "I think somebody set this here on purpose." He nodded once, like we had reached an agreement adults often missed. "Can we leave more tonight?" "We can," I said, "but shoes first, then breakfast." At the stove, he ate oatmeal with brown sugar while I packed his lunch and tried not to stare at the quartz on the counter. It looked out of place among practical things: thermos, pliers, permission slip, 2 mismatched mittens drying by the vent. Eli kept glancing at it between bites. Finally, he asked, "Should we tell anybody?" "Who are you planning to tell?" I asked. He shrugged. "Mrs. Klein, maybe. She likes stories." I snorted before I could stop myself. "Mrs. Klein likes peaches and weather gossip. If we tell folks we're getting thank you rocks from the woods, Roy at the feed store will start giving me side-eye with my mineral block." That got a quick grin out of him. "You already get side-eye." "True," I said, "but I'd like it to stay about my unpaid tab and not my grip on reality." He laughed, a short, real one, and for a second the kitchen sounded like a place people lived in, not just passed through. After I dropped him at school, I drove to the orchard job with the quartz in my jacket pocket, which felt ridiculous and comforting in equal measure. I spent the morning replacing a belt on the cider press motor and tightening a run of loose bolts on a bin tipper. Good, honest mechanical problems, all of them. Metal had limits. Torque specs existed. Bearings failed for reasons. Around noon, while I was rethreading chain through a guard panel, Manny Griggs ambled over with coffee in one hand and a crescent wrench in the other. "You look like you slept in your truck," he said. "Everything all right up your way?" "Fine," I said automatically. He studied me, then jerked his chin toward my pocket. "You carrying a lucky rock now? Didn't peg you for that." I realized I'd been rubbing the quartz through the fabric without noticing. I took my hand out like a kid caught stealing jerky. "Eli found it," I said, "at the tree line." Manny nodded, not pressing. Kids find what we miss. That sat with me the rest of the day. Kids find what we miss. The prevailing consensus in my own head had always been that childhood was for imagination and adulthood was for reality. But the trade-offs in that framework were suddenly plain. If you close every door that doesn't have a hinge you understand, maybe you keep out nonsense. Maybe you also keep out help. By late afternoon, a low bank of cloud had moved in from the west, flattening the light and pulling the smell of wet bark up from the timber. Eli and I did homework at the table, then ate potato soup and toast. He asked if we could take the apples together, and I said yes before my caution could clear its throat. We stood at the coal bin in the shed and sorted with more care than bruised fruit deserved. Eli rejected one with mold, chose 3 red apples with soft spots, then added a yellow one with a split near the stem. "This one for deer too," he said. "How many deer are you feeding now?" "All of them," he said solemnly, and I gave him a look. "You inherited your budget sense from me, I see." Bad. Catastrophic. He laughed again, and Brisket, hearing happy sounds, trotted circles around us like he'd arranged the event. We walked to the tree line with a flashlight we didn't turn on yet. Dusk still held. The orchard behind us was rows and order. Ahead, the timber stood darker, layered, patient. Eli set the apples on the flat stone in a neat line, then placed the split one down by a patch of clover 10 feet away. He didn't narrate it, he just did it, careful as laying out tools. Brisket sat. Same spot, same gap in the firs. Tail thump once. I tried my reasoning cycle again. Neighbor prank. Unlikely. Too consistent. Too quiet. Bear. Possible, but bears don't leave stem fans and cross twigs like they're setting a table. Eli moving things himself. Possible in theory, except he slept like a dropped sack and never beat me outside. My own memory failing. Not on this. Not this cleanly. Evidence suggests intent, I thought, and then almost laughed at myself for sounding like a committee report in my own skull. On the walk back, Eli slipped his hand into my coat pocket and found the quartz. You still have it? Yeah. Why? I opened my mouth with 3 practical answers lined up, and none of them true. Because, I said, I don't want to lose it. He nodded, satisfied. Me neither. That night, the wind picked up after midnight and tapped cedar against the east window in a soft, repeating knock. I woke, lay there, and let my mind run in circles until it wore itself down to one simple line. I wanted this to be ordinary, and I wanted it not to be, both at once. I told myself this couldn't be real in the way my son seemed to mean real, not because the world was small, but because I had survived by keeping it small. I had narrowed life to tasks and invoices and weather forecasts because that scale felt survivable after Mara died. If I admitted there might be kindness moving out there beyond what I could account for, then I had to admit I had been living like a man ducking sunlight. I wasn't ready for belief. I was unexpectedly ready for noticing. At first light, I stepped into a thin mist that hung knee-high over the pasture. The apples were gone from the stone. The split yellow one remained near the clover, untouched, as if someone had decided deer should have first claim on that patch. The stems lay in a tidy row this time. All pointed the same direction toward the timber. Beside them sat 2 acorn caps and a feather, grey with a white tip, arranged like somebody had thought about balance. I crouched for tracks and found impressions in the mud where the grass thinned near the old stump. One print, then another, broad and long with toe marks that were not hoof and not boot. Bigger than my spread hand by plenty. The depth of them told a story all by itself. Heavy, yes, but placed lightly at the edges. No torn sod, no churned earth. The line of prints curved around a patch of new pear seedlings I'd put in last spring, then crossed back to fir shadow without touching a single stake or wire flag. Whatever made them moved with awareness of boundaries. Brisket came up behind me, sniffed one print, then sat down with a small huff, like he had confirmed what he expected. He looked up at me with that old dog, seen-it-all expression, and blinked once. I actually said, "You're not helping," and he yawned in my face, which felt fair. When Eli came out, he didn't run to the stone first. He came to me, looked at my face, then followed my gaze down. "Whoa," he whispered, and knelt without putting his hands in the print. "That's big." "Yep." "Bear. No claw marks. Wrong shape." I paused. "And it stepped around the seedlings." He looked at the tiny pear trees and back to the tracks. "Maybe it knows those are babies." I should have corrected him, steered him toward caution and taxonomy. Instead, I heard myself say, "Maybe it does." We went through the day with that quiet current running under everything. He did spelling at the table. I mended a section of fence by the lower pasture and replaced a cracked float valve in the goat trough. Every so often, one of us looked toward the timber. Not fearful, attentive. Near supper, I called Roy at the feed store to ask about mineral block delivery and, sideways, whether he'd seen odd tracks this season. He chuckled. Odd as in cougar. Odd as in your neighbour's llama got loose again? Define odd. Big, I said. Biped, maybe. Hard to tell in soft mud. He went quiet for a beat. Up on your ridge, things get printed weird with freeze-thaw. If it's not bothering stock, I'd leave it be. I planned to, I said. Good, he replied. You and that boy getting your winter pile in order? Working on it. Do it fast. Forecast says first, hard snap might come early. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen with the phone in my hand and watched Eli at the counter rinsing apples for our strange new evening routine. He held each fruit under the tap, turned it once, set it gently in the bowl. There was reverence in it, and practicality too, like both could exist without fighting. That was new in this house. At dusk we walked out again, not talking much. The mist had burned off, and the sky held a cold, clear blue that meant frost by morning. Eli placed 3 apples on the stone. I set one a little farther back by the clover without being asked. Brisket sat in his post and gave that one measured tail thump towards the fir gap. We stayed a minute longer than usual. The timber carried a faint sound then. Not a snap or crash, but a careful shift of weight through duff and needles, as if something very large had learned patience better than most men I knew. Eli's fingers tightened around mine. I felt him look up at me, waiting for direction. We head in, I said quietly. Nice and easy. He nodded. No argument. We turned and walked back toward Porchlight, Brisket pacing between us and then pausing twice to look behind. Not bristling, just checking. At the steps, Eli said, Dad? Yeah? Can we keep doing this even if we never see it? I looked at the bowl now empty in his hands, at the orchard rows darkening behind him, at the room inside where his math book waited, and Mara's blue mug still sat untouched in the cabinet, because neither of us had been ready to move it. The core of the thing came clear all at once. This ritual wasn't a test anymore. It was a way of practicing care in a world that hadn't asked our permission before breaking us. Yeah, I said, we can keep doing it. That night, after Eli went to bed, I set the quartz on the windowsill over the sink where morning light would find it. I stood there a long time with my hands on the counter, watching the black outline of firs against a thinner moon. The loneliness was still there. Grief was still there. But curiosity had taken a chair at the same table, and that changed the balance of the room. I wasn't fixed. I wasn't finished grieving. I was, for the first time in a long while, interested in tomorrow. Tomorrow came in on a low grey ceiling and a weather radio voice that sounded too cheerful about sleet. I made eggs, burned 1 piece of toast like it was in my contract, and sent Eli to school with 2 pairs of gloves in his pack, because the first pair always ended up wet by noon. Through the day, I kept to practical work, replacing a cracked insulator on the north fence, hauling 2 wheelbarrow loads of split wood to the porch rack, checking the pump house twice like staring at pipes could keep them from freezing. By late afternoon, a mist rolled up from the drawer and sat in the orchard rows at knee height, softening every edge. I told Eli I needed to check the lower gate before dark. He looked up from his spelling sheet. Again? Latch was sticking this morning. He gave me a small side-eye that belonged on a much older kid. Take Brisket. Was planning to. I took the flashlight and left it off. The ground was damp and quiet under my boots, the kind of quiet that made each buckle on my jacket sound too loud. At the lower gate, I did the check fast because that hadn't been the real purpose, and we both knew it. I cut across toward the equipment shed and stood in the corner where the lean-to roof threw a shadow toward the tree-lined stone. From there, I could see the flat rock the clover patch, and the gap in the furs Brisket favored like it was an assigned seat. I waited while the light thinned from grey to blue-grey. One crow crossed high, then none. Brisket sat beside my leg, chest out, calm as always, and every few seconds he turned his head toward that same gap. I told myself I was there to settle my own nonsense. If it was a neighbour, I'd wave and get this over with. If it was a bear, I'd know by movement and shape. If it was Eli sneaking out somehow, I'd march him home and put an end to nighttime missions. I stood there carrying all my tidy explanations like tools in a box. A dark shape separated from the cedars. It didn't rush out. It didn't lunge. It stepped into view with care, one foot placed, then the other, with the deliberate economy of something very heavy that knew exactly where not to put its weight. It was taller than any man I'd ever stood next to, broad through the shoulders, fur dark as wet bark with brown caught in the last of the light. It stopped at the stone and lowered itself slowly to one knee. The movement was so controlled it made my throat close. One hand, if calling it a hand does justice to that size, picked up an apple and turned it gently, almost like checking for bruises. It set that one in a small stack, picked up the second, then the third. When it reached the split yellow apple Eli had left by the clover, it paused, set it back down exactly where it had been, and angled its stem up, like placement mattered. The gesture was tidy and careful, and so unexpectedly polite that for a second my brain had nowhere to file it. Brisket rose and took 3 steps forward. I hissed his name under my breath, but he ignored me in the firm, old dog way that says you can submit a complaint later. He walked out into open ground, tail low and easy, then sat facing the figure. No bark, no growl, just attention. I had spent most of my life trusting dogs over theories. In that minute, that trust did more work than anything in my head. I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out and, because my mind had shorted clear through, I whispered, "Excuse me." I actually said that. To an 8-foot-something stranger at my tree line. If Mara had seen it, she would have laughed for a week. The figure turned its head toward me. Amber-brown eyes caught what little light was left and held it, not bright, just steady. It didn't crouch to spring. It didn't puff itself bigger. It stayed where it was, open and still, one hand resting on its knee, apples gathered in the other arm against its chest. The distance between us felt exact, like it had measured what I could bear, and stopped there. My knees shook once, hard, then steadied. I took 1 step backward toward the shed corner. The figure did not follow. I took another, same result. It watched, not with challenge, but with what I can only call patience. When I reached the shadow line and my shoulder touched rough siding, it turned back to the stone, set 2 acorn caps beside the stems, then stood in one smooth motion and moved into cedar dark, where the mist swallowed edges and size, first, then shape. I stayed there until full dark, hand on the shed post, feeling my pulse in my palms. Brisket came back to me and leaned against my shin like he was checking my wiring again. "You saw that," I said to him, and his tail thumped once against my boot as if to confirm the minutes had happened in ordinary time. Back in the kitchen, Eli looked up before I got my coat off. "Gate okay?" "Latch is fine," I said, then set the flashlight down and sat at the table because my legs had changed their opinion about standing. He watched me the way kids do when they know the weather in a room before adults name it. "What happened?" I rubbed my face and chose each word slow. "I saw something by the apples." "Like what?" "Big. Taller than any person, dark fur. It moved careful." I met his eyes. Brisket walked right up and sat down. Eli's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the dog, then back to me. "Were you scared?" "Yes," I said. "And no, both." He nodded, serious. "Did it take the apples?" "Yeah." "Did it hurt Brisket?" "No." He let out a breath he'd been holding and reached for his pencil again, then paused. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "I told you something was hungry." I laughed once, soft and tired. "You did." After he went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off except over the stove and ran the encounter through every rational filter I owned until each one frayed. Man in a suit. No man moved like that at that size and kept that silence on wet ground. Bear standing oddly? No bear knelt to sort fruit and leave one for deer. Misperception in bad light? Maybe, I told myself. Maybe if not for Brisket's calm and the way those eyes met mine without a trace of panic or aggression. I told myself this couldn't be real in the terms I'd lived by, then had to admit my terms might be too narrow for the ridge I stood on. Around midnight, I pulled the curtain back over the sink and looked towards the orchard. Nothing there but moon-pale rose and fur black beyond. Still, I had the unmistakable sense that hiding and chasing were both the wrong verbs. It hadn't hidden from me. It had waited until I moved, as if my choice mattered in the equation. That unsettled me more than fear would have, because it implied respect, and I hadn't known what to do with respect from people lately, let alone from a being I had no name for. The next evening, Eli asked if we were still leaving apples. I said yes. He carried 4 this time, all bruised but solid, and I carried 1 extra in my coat pocket without saying why. We walked out together in a light drizzle that beaded on Brisket's whiskers. Eli set the apples on the stone and stepped back. We stood in open view, no shed corner, no pretending we were there by accident. Nothing moved for a long minute. Then a careful footfall sounded from cedar needles. Then another. The figure came into the edge of sight and stopped, half in shadow, rain darkening its fur. It watched us. We watched it. Brisket sat down between Eli and me like a little old referee and yawned. Eli whispered, "Hi," barely louder than rain on leaves. The figure lowered itself, slow as before, and reached for the apples. It kept its body angled, not squared up, leaving a lane between us and the porch light behind. That detail hit me hard. Predators close lanes. This did the opposite. One by one, it gathered the fruit, then paused and looked toward me. I took the apple from my pocket and set it on the stone with my hand shaking just enough to annoy me. When I stepped back, it took that one last. I don't have a cleaner way to put it. Disbelief gave way under the weight of repeated gentleness. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic burst. It softened and thinned with each precise movement until wonder could stand where certainty had stood. The world did not become less practical. The pump still needed insulating. Bills still came. Eli still forgot 1 sock in every laundry load. But a new fact entered the framework. Something vast could be careful. Something unknown could choose restraint. A week later, the November freeze arrived in earnest, and practical life stopped being theoretical. Wind shifted north, then east, sharp and dry. A skin of ice formed in the stock trough by dawn. Weather alerts came in one after another about black ice and an early front carrying sleet. I spent the day sprinting chores, wrapped exposed pipe near the pump house, moved feed sacks off the barn's drafty wall, checked the goat pen latch 3 times, then split kindling until my shoulders burned. By dusk I had 1 narrow tarp tied over the woodpile and a pile of unsplit rounds still laughing at me from beside the stump. Inside, Eli spread homework over the table and said, "You forgot to eat lunch again." I had crackers. Crackers are not lunch. Since when are you county nutrition sheriff? Since now. Even tired, I smiled. Yes, sir. After supper, we left 2 apples at the stone because routine mattered more when weather turned mean. Sleet began as we came back to the house. Tiny hard taps on a jacket canvas. By 9 it was steady. I banked the stove, set an alarm for 3 to check pipes, and fell asleep in my work clothes over the blanket. At 3:15 I went out with a headlamp into wind that cut through flannel. The tarp over the main woodpile snapped at one corner but held. What stopped me cold was the lean-to by the back steps. Where I had left a half bin of kindling, there were now 3 neat stacks of split. Dry cedar and fir arranged by size under full cover. Edges aligned, no random toss, not one piece in standing water. I stood there with sleet ticking on the roof, trying to remember if I had done that in some exhausted trance. I had not. My maul still leaned by the stump where I'd left it, and the unsplit rounds were still there under ice glaze. I carried 2 armloads inside and set them by the stove. Eli, half awake on the couch under a blanket, blinked at the pile. "Did you do all that?" "No," I said before I could edit it into something safer. He pushed up on one elbow. "Him?" I nodded once. In the morning, the storm eased to a hard, bright cold that made every branch look edged in glass. I pulled on boots to check the east fence and found another gift written in effort. A narrow path tamped firm through drift and crust from barn to pump house, then onto the goat pen, each step deep and wide, repeated enough times to make a usable track where I'd been post-holing to my knees the day before. Whoever made it had walked the route I ran most, over and over, turning chaos into a corridor. At the east fence, Brisket nosed ahead and stopped by a tangle of wire near the ditch. A small fawn stood there on shaking legs, one hind leg marked with a shallow line where old snare wire had been. The wire lay coiled on the ground, twisted open cleanly at a point no deer could reach with teeth. The fawn looked at us, ears forward, then bounded 3 clumsy steps and paused in brush, alive and whole. I crouched by the wire with gloves on and felt the twist. Not cut, untwisted, then bent back, done with strength and care. Eli came up beside me, breathing little clouds into the cold. "It got it out." "Yeah," I said, throat tight. "It did." He watched the fawn disappear into alder. He helps things. I sat back on my heels and looked at the path stamped toward home, at the frosted orchard beyond, at my son standing steady in boots still too new and too big. The kindness was no longer abstract or symbolic. It was wood kept dry before sleet, a route made passable in freeze, an animal freed from pain at our fence line, deliberate, unmistakable, aimed right at the fragile little world Eli and I were trying to keep standing. "We should leave apples tonight," Eli said quietly. "We will," I answered, "and maybe a little more than apples." That evening I filled a small bucket with windfall apples, 2 carrots, and a scoop of cracked corn, and Eli watched me from the mudroom bench while he tugged on his boots. "You said maybe more than apples," he said. I did. He stood and took the bucket from me like it was a shared job, not a favour. For deer too. For deer too, for whoever needs it. Outside, the cold had a hard edge to it, the kind that made the inside of your nose sting on the first breath. The sky was still bright over the western ridge, but down in the orchard rows, shadow had already settled into the low spots. We walked to the stone with Brisket pacing ahead, and Eli set the apples down one by one, with that same careful attention he always gave them. I poured the corn in a small arc near the clover and tucked the carrots beside it. No speeches, no superstition, just food where food might help. On the walk back, he said, Do you think he likes that we share? I think he notices. You keep saying he. I glanced at him. You do too. He shrugged, a little embarrassed and a little pleased. Yeah. By supper, the first wave of the hard front came through. Not much snow yet, just a dry wind and sleet beginning to tick against the windows. I checked the weather radio, checked the pump house, checked the goat pen. Junie and the other two goats had shelter in the lee side run, but Junie was old and stubborn and had a habit of wedging herself in dumb places when weather turned. I told Eli twice not to go out alone after dark. He rolled his eyes the way 11-year-olds do and said, I know, Dad. We ate beef stew at the table with our coats still hanging damp by the stove. Eli did math while I wrapped another length of insulation around the back pipe and cut strips of old feed sacks to tie over gaps in the barn door. The wind rose by degrees, and around 6:30 the lights flickered once, then held. I remember hearing that tiny dip in the refrigerator hum and feeling my chest tighten for no good reason. At 7, I stepped into the mudroom to pull on boots and check stock one more time. Eli looked up from his workbook. I'll bring Junie in closer, he said. She keeps standing by the east wire. You wait for me. It's just the gate. Eli. He held my eyes for a second, then nodded. Okay. I went out first to clear ice off the pump house latch. It took longer than it should have because my gloves were wet and I had to chip a frozen hinge pin with the back of a wrench. When I came back across the path, the kitchen light was bright in the window, Brisket was gone from his bed by the stove, and the mudroom door stood open 3 inches with sleet slanting through. I called his name once. No answer. I called again, louder, and my own voice came back thin in the wind. That old panic I had kept boxed since Mara died came up hard and fast. I went down the tamped path at a near run, boots slipping where fresh glaze sat over packed snow, and I yelled for him and for Junie and for Brisket all together like one long prayer. The orchard edge was dark, branches clicking in gusts. I cut toward the east fence where Junie liked to browse and saw motion through the sleet, tall and dark and steady beside a sagging section of woven wire. Eli stood 10 feet back near the cedar trunk, hat gone, both hands gripping the fence post, Brisket planted at his leg like a sentry. Junie was down on one knee with her hind legs tangled where a bent panel had twisted under ice load, and between Eli and a long branch bowed with sleet, there he was, in full, broad-shouldered and calm, one massive hand holding the wire up and away, while the other worked the tangle loose with a care I had not seen in many people. The branch above gave a long creak and settled lower. He shifted his stance, placing his body so that if it dropped, it would strike him first, and not the boy. No rush, no display, just a precise, practical act in mean weather, the same way a good hand at the mill braces a failing chain until somebody else gets clear. I slowed without meaning to. The scene was too exact to break with noise. He bent, lifted the woven wire panel an inch, then another, and Junie pulled free in one awkward scramble. She shook, sneezed, and trotted straight toward me, offended and alive. He stayed where he was until she had passed me by, then lowered the panel quietly back into snow. Eli's knit cap lay near his feet, half buried in sleet. He reached down, picked it up between 2 fingers that looked too large for that kind of delicate work, and held it toward my son. Eli did not step forward right away. He looked at me first. It's okay, I said, though my voice cracked on the second word. Eli took 2 small steps, took his cap, and whispered, "Thank you." The big head dipped once, barely, and he stepped back to open space between himself and us. His eyes came to mine then, amber brown under wet fur, and the look in them held no claim and no demand. Just patience, just attention. Like he had watched us struggle all season and decided where he could help without frightening us. Something gave way in me right there in that blowing sleet, with a goat chewing on my coat cuff and my son clutching a wet knit cap. I had spent months clamping every feeling down to manageable size because I thought that was what made me a reliable father. Keep moving, keep fixing, keep your mouth shut when grief rises. But the trade-off had been costly. I had left Eli alone inside my silence while pretending I was protecting him from it. I dropped to my knees in the snow, grabbed him around the shoulders, and cried into his coat for the first time since the hospital parking lot. Not loud, not dramatic, just full and unhidden and longer than I expected. I felt him stiffen in surprise, then fold into me and hold on. "I'm sorry," I said into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry I've been halfway with you." He shook his head against my jacket. "You're here." "I know. But I haven't been all the way here." I pulled back enough to look at him. Sleet had stuck to his eyelashes. "I miss her every day. I miss your mom every single day. Mara. I miss Mara so bad some mornings I can't breathe right. And I kept trying not to say it because I thought, if I started, I wouldn't stop." His face crumpled and steadied all at once, the way kids do when they've been waiting to hear what they already knew. "I miss her too," he said, and his voice came out thin. "I talk to her in my room sometimes." "I know." I swallowed hard. "I should have talked with you, not around it." He nodded, crying now, and not hiding that either. Brisket pressed into both of us, warm and damp and determined to be included. Junie sneezed again and head-butted my shoulder like she objected to emotional delays in bad weather. I laughed through tears because that goat had no sense of timing, and maybe that saved us. Eli laughed too once, then wiped his face with the back of his glove. When I looked up, he was still there at the cedar line, giving us room. I rose slowly with one hand on Eli's shoulder. "Thank you," I said, speaking past the wind, not expecting any sign back and getting one anyway. He held my gaze a second, then stepped farther into shadow. No hurry, no drama. By the time we got Junie through the gate and into the barn aisle with fresh bedding, he had moved beyond what the porch light could reach. We heard one soft shift through fir needles, then nothing but sleet and the barn roof ticking under ice. Inside the house, Eli stripped off wet gloves and held his hands over the stove vent. I made hot chocolate too sweet and didn't apologize for it. We sat at the table with steam rising and watched the storm draw lines down the window. "Dad?" he said after a while. "Yeah." "Do we keep leaving apples?" "We do." He turned his mug in his hands. "Not because he's hungry now, because we're saying thank you." "Exactly." He thought for a minute. "Can we say Mom's name more?" The question landed clean and true. "Yes," I said. "We can say Mara whenever we need to, at supper, in the truck, anywhere." He nodded and stared into his cup, then said, almost shy, "Mara liked cinnamon in cocoa." I stood, found the jar, and shook cinnamon into both our mugs. We drank in silence that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt shared. Sometime near midnight, the sleet turned to fine snow. I woke to check pipes and found the wind dropped and the world muffled. Under the backlight, the stone at the tree line was visible as a pale oval. I could just make out apples still lined there, untouched, each one dusted with new snow. Not taken, not scattered. Waiting. At dawn, we walked out together, boots crunching. The apples sat in a straight row like markers. Beside them, set with care, was a small cedar sprig and one smooth stick laid parallel to the stone's edge. The gesture felt final in a quiet way, as if the exchange had shifted from provision to acknowledgement. Eli reached out, then stopped short of touching. "Should we leave these for deer now?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Let's move them to the clover." We carried them over and spread them where tracks already crossed. Deer, rabbit, little bird hops between. I kept the cedar sprig and set it on the kitchen windowsill beside the quartz. Light hit both and turned the stone bright at one edge. That evening we took 2 apples anyway. Habit had its own comfort. We placed them on the flat stone and stepped back. Dusk settled in bands across the orchard, and for a long time nothing moved except snow sifting off a bent fir limb. Then, at the far cedar break, a tall, dark shape stood just within shadow. Not approaching, not retreating, watching. Eli lifted his hand chest high in a small wave. I did the same after half a beat. Brisket sat and gave one patient tail thump. The shape remained for maybe 10 breaths, then turned and moved through timber with that same measured quiet, each step set with care. He did not come to the apples. He did not look back again. He simply went, as if to say what needed saying had been said. The next morning, the apples were still there, frozen hard and bright. We moved them to the clover patch and left no fresh ones that night. Not from fear, not from disappointment. It felt complete. Practical life rushed in again because that's what weather does. The freeze still had teeth, and we had work. Eli and I spent the next day in the barn loft, sorting old hay tarps by what could still hold out wet. He tied knots while I stapled insulation along the pump house seam. We argued about the best way to brace the chicken run door and settled it by testing both ideas in wind. His brace held better. I told him so. At lunch, we sat on overturned buckets in the barn aisle, eating ham sandwiches while Junie tried to steal mine. Eli said, "You used a full sentence." "I did? Yesterday you'd have said good job and walked off. Today you said why it worked." I leaned back against a post and looked at him. "I'm trying." "I know." That was one of the biggest moments of the whole winter, and it was just sandwiches in a barn. 2 days later, I took him with me to Roy's feed store because the roads finally cleared enough for chains off. Roy rang up mineral block, cracked corn, and a coil of new fence wire while Eli wandered the aisle reading labels he didn't need. Roy looked at me over the register and said, "You look different, less haunted." I could have shrugged it off like I always had. Instead, I rested my forearms on the counter and answered plain. "Been a rough year. I got tired of acting like talking made it worse." Roy nodded slow. "Talking usually makes it less lonely." "Yeah," I said. "Turns out." He slid the receipt over. "You and that boy doing okay?" "We are," I said, and for once, it wasn't a reflex. "We're doing okay." On the drive home, Eli watched the ridgeline through the truck window, then said, "You didn't tell him." "About what?" He gave me that look. "You know." "No," I said. "Some things aren't for the whole county." He smiled. "Good." That night, after dishes, he stood at the cabinet and touched Mara's blue mug. "Can we use it?" I swallowed and nodded. "We can." He filled it with hot tea and set it between us on the table while we worked his science worksheet. It was a small object, chipped at the handle, faded at the rim, and it no longer felt like a landmine. It felt like a place setting, a way to include her in the room without shattering. When the next front rolled through, we were ready in a way we hadn't been before. Wood stacked high and dry. Pipe wraps doubled. Feed under cover. Paths tamped by our own boots now, not borrowed strength. Eli kept a checklist on the fridge and crossed items off with red pencil. Tongue caught at one corner of his mouth while he wrote. I watched him move through chores with confidence that came from being trusted, and I understood that fatherhood had never been about protecting him from the existence of pain. It was about showing him how to stand inside it without closing the door on wonder. One clear morning after the freeze finally broke, sun hit the south slope and turned the crust to glitter. I carried a load of scrap wire to the burn barrel and past the east fence where Junie had tangled that night. The bent panel was repaired now, tight and true. Beside the post half sunk in thawing mud, I found one deep old print preserved where shadow had held the ground. Broad, long, toe marks soft at the edges. I stood over it in silence, then went back for Eli. He knelt beside it, careful not to step too close. Still here? Yeah, he looked up. Should we cast it? I thought about plaster, measurements, proof for people who would laugh or fight or ask for coordinates like wonder was a hunting permit. Then I shook my head. No, let it go back to the ridge. He studied me a second, then nodded. Okay. We sat on the fence rail for a while, saying nothing, listening to meltwater drip from cedar tips. Brisket nosed through thawed grass and flopped down in a sun patch like an old dog who had done his part and expected retirement benefits. That evening, for the first time in weeks, I walked alone to the tree line at dusk. Not because I was searching, just because it had become a place where I told the truth. The flat stone was bare except for one acorn cap and wind-blown needles. The fir gap beyond held ordinary shadow. Birds moved in the brush. Somewhere downslope a jay complained about everything. The ridge sounded like itself again. I took the quartz from my pocket, because by then I carried it most days without thinking, and set it on the stone for a minute, palm resting over it. Thank you, I said out loud, not caring who heard. Then I picked it back up and carried it home. In the kitchen, I put it on the windowsill beside the cedar sprig, now dry and pale. Eli came in with an armload of kindling and saw where I'd set it. That's its spot now? Yeah. He stacked wood by the stove and wiped his hands on his jeans. Dad? Yeah. He grinned, quick and boyish. You're talking more. I grinned back. I noticed. We made chili, burned the cornbread edges and laughed about it while snowmelt ticked from the eaves. After supper, he asked me to tell a story about Mara from before he was born. And instead of giving him the short, safe version, I told him the whole one. How she once changed attire in a white church dress on County Road 9, and then walked into a wedding with grease on her knuckles, and no embarrassment at all. He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his milk. I laughed too, and by the end, we were both crying a little, and neither of us looked away. Later, when the house settled and Eli turned pages in his room, I stood at the back window with Brisket's heavy head, leaning against my calf, and looked out where orchard met timber. I still didn't have explanations that would satisfy a committee. I had no photograph, no cast print, no neat argument. What I had was better and harder, a set of witnessed acts that reworked my framework from the inside. Evidence of watchful kindness. Proof, at least for me, that mystery and practicality do not cancel each other out. They can share the same ridge. I had gone into that winter believing safety meant controlling every variable and speaking only in manageable pieces. I came out understanding a different kind of steadiness. Steadiness is saying your wife's name when it hurts. Steadiness is letting your son see you cry and finding out he trusts you more, not less. Steadiness is stacking wood, mending fence, paying feed bills, and still leaving room for what you cannot explain. We still put apples out sometimes, but not every night, and not as a test. Some evenings Eli carries one bruised red apple to the stone on his way back from shutting the coop, sets it down, and comes in without waiting. Some mornings it's gone. Some mornings deer got it. Some mornings frost keeps it there untouched, bright against grey rock. We don't force meaning onto each outcome. The ritual is gratitude now, plain and steady. If you came by the house today, you'd see the quartz on the kitchen sill catching morning light beside Mara's blue mug, and a jar of cinnamon we use too freely in cocoa. You'd see a checklist on the fridge in Eli's blocky handwriting, and a tighter winter setup than we had that first year. You'd hear more full sentences than half ones. You'd hear a father and son arguing about homework and laughing about goats and saying a missing woman's name without flinching. And if dusk found you standing with me at the back pasture, where orchard gives way to fir, I'd point to the tree line and tell you only what I know for certain. We were not as alone as we thought. Something large and gentle moved through our hardest season and chose, again and again, to be careful with what we loved. I don't need more than that. It returned me to my own life with steadier hands, and that has been enough.